The crowd thought it would be just another political showdown, but within minutes, it felt like watching a lion walk into a trap only for the hunters to realize they were the prey. Gavin Newsom, the self-assured face of California politics, stepped onto the stage with a grin that screamed victory before the debate even began. The bright studio lights gleamed off his tailored suit as he waved casually to the audience, a man convinced he had already won the night. Cameras panned across the live audience, catching nods of approval from Newsom's supporters and murmurs of expectation. Millions watching at home were ready to see him tear apart his opponents. That was the script everyone expected. But what happened instead would leave the nation stunned. Do you think justice was served tonight? Drop your answer below, and tell me your country and city. Let's see where the truth is being heard loudest. J.D. Vance sat quietly at the far end of the stage, hands clasped, expression unreadable, almost like a man preparing for a chess game rather than a televised brawl. His calmness wasn't weakness, it was strategy. He wasn't here to entertain, he was here to expose. Beside him, Greg Gutfeld leaned back in his chair, smirking like a man who had already rehearsed the punchlines that would go viral before sunrise. Together, they looked mismatched, one composed and deliberate, the other unpredictable and ruthless, but that contrast was exactly what made them dangerous. Newsom's confidence dripped into arrogance as he began, firing off rehearsed zing, painting Vance and Gutfeld as out-of-touch opportunists. His voice was smooth, his delivery polished, the kind of performance that wins applause but hides insecurity. Because underneath that grin, there was something else he needed: this victory. His political image had taken hits in recent weeks, and this debate was his chance to rebuild the myth of Gavin Newsom, the unbeatable statesman. That desperation would soon betray him. Vance said nothing at first, letting the attacks pile up, his silence forcing Newsom to grow bolder, louder, more reckless. The audience started to sense it, the quiet before a storm. And then, without raising his voice, Vance finally spoke. His tone was steady, his words sharp enough to cut through Newsom's practiced lines like glass shattering against concrete. Gutfeld, sensing the shift, leaned forward with a grin that could only mean one thing: it was time to strike. The room's energy flipped in seconds. Gasps replaced polite applause, and people in the audience whispered to each other. Phones lifted to record what felt like history in real time. Social media feeds began to erupt: tweets, live reactions, hashtags climbing by the second. And as Vance delivered his opening line, followed by Gutfeld's perfectly timed jab, it felt like the entire stage tilted in their direction. Gavin Newsom's smile faltered for the first time that night, a flash of panic breaking through the mask. And at that moment, everyone watching, whether in the studio or across the country, realized this wasn't going to be a debate. This was going to be a dismantling. Gavin Newsom didn't just speak, he pounced. The moment the moderator handed him the floor, he leaned forward with the intensity of a predator circling prey. His voice was smooth, but there was venom under every word. Each syllable meant to sting. Let's be honest here, he began, his tone casual, almost mocking. J.D. Vance talks about representing the working class, but that's Rich Litt, a guy who made millions writing about his tough childhood, who climbed the corporate ladder, who now lives in gated luxury. And he wants to lecture us on struggle. A wave of polite laughter rippled through the audience. Newsom smirked, feeding off it, his confidence swelling. He wasn't finished. He turned to Gutfeld, eyebrows raised in theatrical disbelief, and Greg Newsom said, his voice dipping into sarcasm, America's favorite late-night comedian who calls himself a truth-teller. You've built your entire career on mockery, throwing cheap insults to get clicks. That's not courage, Greg, that's desperation for ratings. Maybe try solving problems instead of turning every serious issue into a punchline. The audience laughed louder this time, some even applauding. Newsom could feel the momentum. He shifted back to Vance, his tone sharper now, almost accusatory. Senator, you vote against funding for education, you block healthcare expansion, you oppose relief programs for families, and you sit here pretending you're the voice of morality. No, let's call it what it is. You're not fighting for working people. You're fighting for your donors and your own career. Tell me, JD, how does that make you any different from every other opportunist pretending to care? The camera caught Newsom's smirk as he leaned back, crossing his legs like a man certain he'd just delivered a fatal blow. The crowd applauded, louder, a few people even cheering. For a second, it looked like Newsom had won the round, but J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even shift in his chair. He sat perfectly still, letting the applause die down, his calm presence creating an awkward silence that stretched longer than expected. The audience sensed something, they just didn't know what was coming. And then he spoke. Gavin, Vance began, his voice so steady it cut through the noise like glass breaking. You talk about my childhood like it's a brand, but for me, it was survival. My family didn't have lobbyists. We didn't have safety nets. We had food stamps and fear of eviction. So, if you want to talk about who gets to fight for working families, I'll take my experience over your soundbites. Any day. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some clapping softly. Vance didn't stop. His tone hardened, his words striking with precision. You brag about compassion, but the state you run is collapsing under the weight of your policies. California has record homelessness. Businesses are fleeing. Families are leaving because they can't afford to live there anymore. You throw billions at problems and call it progress while people sleep on sidewalks 2 blocks from your office. So maybe before you question my moral compass, you should check your own backyard. A gasp swept through the room. People turned to each other, whispering. One man in the front row actually clapped loudly, starting a ripple of scattered applause. And then Gutfeld pounced, leaning forward with a grin that screamed game over. He added, "Oh, and Gavin, about those sidewalks JD mentioned, are those the ones covered in needles or the ones lined with tents? Hard to keep track in your model state, right?" The audience erupted this time, laughter mixed with cheers. Phones shot into the air, recording every second. On Twitter, hashtags began to spike. Hashtag Vance destroys Newsom. Hashtag Gutfeld savage. And hashtag live TV meltdown. For the first time, Newsom's smile cracked. His jaw tightened, his hand twitched against the armrest, his eyes darted toward the moderator as if looking for an escape. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by something far more human. Panic. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. What started as a one-sided attack had turned into a slow, public dismantling. Gutfeld leaned back in his chair, satisfied, while Vance stayed perfectly composed, staring at Newsom with the quiet confidence of a man who had just taken control. Applause grew louder, longer, breaking into cheers from sections of the audience that had been silent moments ago. Newsom tried to smile, but the cameras caught it wasn't confidence anymore. It was desperation. And yet, no one in that room was ready for what would come next, because this was just the first crack in the dam. What followed would be a flood so overwhelming that even Gavin Newsom wouldn't be able to spin his way out of it. Gavin Newsom wasn't just rattled, he was angry. The cracks in his polished confidence were showing, and this time, he didn't bother to hide them. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his voice louder now, sharper, like a man desperate to claw back control. "Let's cut the fairy tales. JD," he snapped, no longer bothering with polite sarcasm. "You'd love to play the victim card, telling everyone how hard your life was. But now you're sitting here in a $1,000 suit, lecturing the rest of us. You've sold out. You're no different from the people you claim to fight against." The audience murmured, some clapping weakly, unsure whether to cheer or cringe at his aggression. But Newsom pressed harder, ignoring them. "And you know what's worse?" Newsom continued, his finger pointing directly at Vance, his tone almost accusing. "You talk about fixing America, but you've voted against child tax credits, against affordable health care, against programs that would have helped the very kids you claim to care about. You're not a hero, JD, you're a politician in disguise and another fraud selling anger because it pays." The words hung in the air, harsh and heavy. Newsom turned to Gutfeld with a glare that could cut glass. "And Greg, let's be a clown. You don't come here to debate, you come here to throw insults. Every night you sit behind a desk and make fun of people like me, but when it comes to real solutions, you've got nothing. You're a sideshow act pretending to be a journalist." This time, the audience reacted more strongly. Some laughed, some booed, but the tension in the room spiked. Newsom straightened his jacket, smirking as if he had regained his footing. The cameras zoomed in on him, catching that look of self-satisfaction. He thought he had landed the blow that would finally silence them. But JD Vance didn't panic. He didn't shift, didn't even blink. Instead, he looked straight at Newsom with a calm that seemed almost unnerving. The room grew silent, the kind of silence where even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. When Vance spoke, his tone was deliberate, quiet enough to make everyone lean in. "Gavin, you call this a challenge, but you just exposed your own failure. The fact that this question sounds impossible to you tells everyone watching why California is falling apart." Gasps rippled through the audience. Newsom's smirk flickered for just a moment. Vance leaned forward now, his voice firmer, sharper. "Here's how you cut homelessness in half without gutting education or healthcare. Stop turning public spaces into lawless free zones by actually enforcing the laws on your books. Stop throwing billions at bloated agencies that spend more on salaries than shelter. Redirect that money to emergency mental health treatment and addiction recovery programs you've let sit unfunded for years. And here's the part you really won't like: strip away the layers of red tape, choking private housing development, and let builders create low-cost units at scale. You know this. You just won't do it because crisis keeps you relevant." The audience exploded into whispers, then applause that quickly grew louder. A woman in the front row stood up and clapped, her voice caught on camera shouting, "Exactly." Phones shot into the air, and within seconds, Twitter and TikTok began lighting up with hashtags. Hashtag Vance Schools Newsom. Hashtag California Exposed. Hashtag JD for the win. Newsom, single quotes S. Face hardened, his jaw tight, but Vance wasn't finished. His voice dropped lower, almost like he was speaking directly to Newsom, not the audience. You wanted specifics, Gavin. There's your plan, and the fact you had to ask me for live TV proves you never had one. The crowd roared. Cheers drowned out the moderator's attempts to move on. Greg Gutfeld seized the moment, leaning forward with a grin that looked almost cruel. Congratulations, Gavin, Gutfeld said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You just asked the question that ended your own argument. Next time, maybe do your homework before you try to play teacher. The audience erupted into laughter, some people standing, clapping, chanting Vance's name. Newsom sat frozen, the confident grin gone, replaced by a tight clenched jaw. He tried to smile, but the cameras caught at his eyes betrayed him, and just when everyone thought Vance was finished, he turned back to the audience, his tone dropping to something even colder, more personal. You want to know the real reason? Gavin's never solved this problem, Vance said, pausing just long enough for silence to fall again. Because fixing it would take away the one thing his career depends on, people staying broken. The audience gasped louder than ever, some people shouting OHHHH, as if they were watching a heavyweight knockout. Newsom's face went pale for just a moment, his mouth opening slightly as if to respond. But no words came out, and then J.D. Vance leaned back, expression calm, almost emotionless, as the crowd erupted into deafening cheers. But no one in that studio, not even Greg Gutfeld, expected what Vance would do next. Because he wasn't done humiliating Gavin Newsom. He was about to destroy him in a way no one saw coming. Gavin Newsom's mask was cracking, and everyone could see it. The once polished governor now looked like a man scrambling to hold sand in his hands as it slipped away. His smile twitched unnaturally, his shoulders tightened, and his words, once smooth and calculated, started to come out rushed, defensive. Let's not pretend this is some miracle performance. Senator, Newsom snapped, his tone sharper than before. You've had months to rehearse your lines. You're playing to the cameras, not the people. It's easy to sit there and criticize California. When you've never had to govern a state like this, you talk a big game, but you don't understand the scale of the problems we're dealing with. The audience murmured, but it wasn't the confident reaction Newsom expected. A few weak claps came from the back, drowned out by scattered whispers. He pushed harder, his words coming faster now, almost desperate. And for the record, he continued, pointing his finger toward Vance. We're making progress. Homelessness isn't solved overnight. At least we're trying to do something, unlike you, who seems more interested in embarrassing me on TV than helping anyone. But J.D. Vance didn't even flinch. He waited for Newsom to finish, then leaned in, his voice low, calm, and terrifyingly controlled. You know what's interesting, Gavin, Vance said, his tone almost conversational. Every time you're pressed for real answers, you hide behind two excuses. It's complicated, and at least I'm trying. But trying doesn't count when kids are growing up in tents and families are running from your state to survive. You call me a performer? No, Gavin, you're the one acting. And the problem is, no one's buying the script anymore. The audience gasped, followed by a wave of cheers and applause that grew louder by the second. Some stood, clapping, while others shouted. That's right. Phones were in the air again, capturing every moment for social media. Newsom shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable now. His forced grin slipped completely, replaced by a clenched jaw and darting eyes. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out fast enough. Vance turned slightly toward the audience, his voice firm, carrying authority now. Leadership isn't about excuses. It's about results. If after years in power your only defense is be patient, maybe you're in the wrong job, because the people suffering under your leadership don't have the luxury of waiting for you to figure it out. The studio erupted, loud cheers, whistles, even some audience members chanting Vance's name. The cameras caught Newsom's face perfectly, tight, pale, his hands gripping the table as if to keep himself steady. And then Greg Gutfeld, grinning like a predator, smelling blood, delivered the jab that sent the crowd roaring. Gavin, if this is you winning, I'd hate to see what losing looks like. Laughter exploded across the room. Newsom tried to smirk, but it came out stiff, almost painful. He looked less like a confident governor and more like a man desperately waiting for the segment to end. JDVance.com, as ever, leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Newsom with an almost pitying stare. Then, in a voice so steady it sent chills through the room, he said, "You've run out of excuses, Gavin, and next, you're going to run out of lies." The crowd went silent, leaning forward, sensing something monumental was about to happen, because what Vance was about to reveal next would leave Gavin Newsom with nothing, no defense, no spin, no way out. Gavin Newsom sat rigid, his smile now more of a grimace, but he tried one last time to claw back control. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice louder, more theatrical, as if sheer volume could overpower what had just happened. "Look, JD," he said, gesturing grandly to the crowd. You can throw insults. You can paint your perfect fantasy solutions. But let's be honest, governing isn't magic. It's messy, it's complicated, and people who promise quick fixes are either lying or they don't understand what leadership actually is. He forced a laugh, glancing at the audience as if expecting them to agree, but the reaction was muted, a few weak claps, scattered murmurs, nothing close to the energy earlier. Newsom's tone hardened, betraying his irritation. And let's not pretend this debate means anything tomorrow, he added sharply. People aren't tuning in for cheap shots. They care about progress, about action. I'm in the trenches every day doing the real work. While you, he pointed at Vance, his voice almost trembling with anger, you sit here throwing stones because it gets you clicks. You're not here to help, you're here to perform. The audience murmured again, but this time, it felt uneasy. Some shook their heads. The tension in the room was thick. J.D. Vance didn't respond immediately. He just stared at Newsom, his face calm, almost pitying, letting the silence drag until the discomfort became unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but every word landed like a sledgehammer. Gavin, do you even hear yourself anymore? Vance asked, his tone steady, deliberate. You're telling people that failure is just part of the job. You're saying, be patient, while families are losing everything, and you're calling anyone who demands better a liar. That's not leadership. That's arrogance. The audience gasped. Then applause broke out, louder this time. Newsom shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. Vance leaned forward, his eyes locked on him. His voice grew sharper, colder. You talk about being in the trenches. Real leaders get people out of the trenches. But you've built a career keeping them there. Because broken people are easier to control, and you know it. The crowd erupted, cheers, whistles, clapping, some people standing. Social media notifications flashed on phones in the audience. Live tweets exploding. Vance destroys Newsom live. This is career-ending for Gavin. Newsom's face hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but stopped. The cameras caught it perfectly. His silence, his clenched jaw, his eyes darting downward. J.D. Vance sat back, calm as ever, and delivered his final blow. His voice lowered, controlled, cutting through the noise. You're right about one thing, Gavin. People won't remember every word said here tonight, but they will remember this: how, when you were finally pressed for answers, all you had left were excuses, and excuses don't fix lives. The room exploded into a standing ovation. Cheers so loud the moderator couldn't even speak over it. Gutfeld laughed openly, shaking his head as if even he hadn't expected it to go this far. Newsom sat motionless, his humiliation playing out live for millions watching. And just as the noise reached its peak, Vance leaned slightly toward the mic, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the entire room in seconds. And if you think tonight was bad, Gavin, wait until people hear what I'm about to show them next. The crowd froze, gasps breaking out again. Newsom's head jerked toward Vance, his expression shifting from anger to sudden worry. The real shock was just beginning. The studio had fallen into an uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of cameras. Gavin Newsom sat stiff, his shoulders tense, his usual smirk completely gone. For the first time all night, he looked defeated. His eyes darted toward the moderator, then back at J.D. Vance. But no words came. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, letting out a slow, audible sigh. And then, in a rare moment of honesty, or maybe pure exhaustion, Newsom muttered into the mic, his voice quieter than before. If that's what you believe, J.D., maybe you should be the one running this show. The audience gasped, some even cheering at the remark. But not for Newsom. It wasn't a compliment, it was surrender. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes dropping to the desk, no longer trying to fight. The once dominant governor had faded into the background of his own debate. J.D. Vance didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He waited for the cheers to fade, then leaned forward, his voice calm, sharp, and commanding. Gavin's right about one thing, Vance began, his words cutting through the silence like steel. Leadership is about stepping up when others fail. And too many leaders in this country are failing because they think their excuses are more important than your lives. But let me say this, clearly your suffering is not acceptable collateral for someone else's career. The crowd erupted into applause, standing now, the noise deafening. Cameras caught the look on Newsom's face. He didn't even attempt to speak again. Vance raised his voice just enough to rise above the cheers, looking straight into the cameras. If you're watching this, remember, the only reason bad leadership survives is because we let it. Demand better. Don't settle for politicians who tell you to wait while your families struggle. You deserve more, and you have the right to hold every single one of us accountable. The cheering grew louder, chants starting to break out. But Vance wasn't finished. His eyes narrowed, his tone dropping to a chilling calm. Share this moment. Talk about it. Because the only thing corrupt power fears is being exposed. The crowd roared, some people chanting his name, others raising their phones to capture every second. Newsom sat frozen, a shadow of the confident man who had walked onto the stage an hour earlier, and just as the ovation reached its peak, J.D. Vance delivered one final, quiet line that silenced the room instantly. "Tonight, you saw a debate. Tomorrow, you'll see the evidence." The crowd gasped, the noise turning into frantic whispers. Newsom's head snapped toward Vance, his face pale, panic flickering in his eyes. The real war had just begun.